I had never given it much thought before Diane, my stepmother, was always around, always present. At 63, she carried an elegance that many women her age lacked. But tonight, something felt different. My best friend Matt had come over like usual, but the way he looked at her and the way she smiled back, it was like something new was happening between them that I hadn't noticed before. It began innocently enough, with all of us seated around the dinner table, but as the evening went on, I could feel a growing tension. Diane's hand brushed Matt's as she cleared the table, her touch lingering just a bit too long. Matt's eyes followed her as she moved through the room, his gaze resting on her in a way I'd never seen him look at anyone before. After dinner, Diane excused herself, saying she was heading to her bedroom. I didn't think much of it, assuming she was just preparing for bed. But a few minutes later, Matt said he needed to use the bathroom. He walked down the hall, and again, I didn't pay attention until I heard a soft knock on her bedroom door. My heart raced as I began to understand what was happening. Curiosity got the better of me, and after a few moments, I crept down the hallway, making sure my steps were quiet. As I approached the door, I could hear soft murmurs, hushed voices on the other side. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear against the door. "I shouldn't be here," I barely heard Matt's voice say. "Then why did you come?" Diane replied, her tone soft and seductive. There was a brief silence, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of lips meeting. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized they were kissing. I could picture it: Matt, my best friend, pulling her close, his hands on her waist, and Diane's fingers running through his hair, deepening the kiss. I knew I should walk away, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the floor as I listened to the soft gasps and whispers. The sounds grew more intense, and then I heard the bed creak as they moved onto it. My mind raced with images of what was unfolding, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I stood there, paralyzed, as my best friend and stepmom crossed a line that could never be undone. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The noises from the room continued: soft moans, the rustling of sheets, the creaking bed, and then silence. My heart pounded as I backed away from the door, retreating down the hall, my thoughts a chaotic whirl of what I had just overheard. When Matt finally emerged from the bedroom, his face was flushed, and he avoided making eye contact with me. Diane followed a moment later, her hair slightly disheveled, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. They both acted as if nothing unusual had just happened, but I knew the truth. From that night forward, everything was different. As they returned to the living room, I pretended not to notice. My heart was still racing from what I had overheard. Matt sat across from me, his eyes darting everywhere except at mine. Diane, however, was the picture of calm. She smoothed her clothes and offered a casual smile, as if nothing had transpired just moments before. "I'm going to bed," she said, her voice steady, betraying no trace of guilt. "Good night, boys." Her eyes lingered on Matt for just a second too long, and I caught it. She then turned and disappeared up the stairs, leaving Matt and me in a heavy silence. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't know where to begin. Matt looked pale and nervous, running a hand through his hair before finally speaking, his voice shaky. "Look, man, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened back there." He tried to brush it off, but I saw the guilt in his eyes. "You don't know what happened," I shot back, my voice harsher than I intended. "You went into her room, Matt. You know exactly what happened." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and for a moment I thought he might try to deny it, but instead he sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I didn't plan for it to happen, okay? She came on to me, and I didn't stop it." Hearing him admit it made the knot in my stomach tighten even more. I had always trusted Matt. We'd been through everything together, and now it felt like he had betrayed me in the worst possible way. But more than that, I couldn't stop thinking about Diane, how she had been the one to start it. I didn't know how to feel anger, jealousy, confusion. All of it swirled together in my head, making it impossible to think clearly. "Why her?" Matt, I asked, my voice softer now, trying to make sense of it. "Why my stepmom?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the floor for what felt like an eternity before finally looking up at me, his expression filled with regret and something darker. "There's just something about her, man," he said quietly. "She's not like other women. the way she looks at you, the way she makes you feel. I don't know how to explain it. I couldn't stop myself. Anger surged in my chest again. I wanted to yell at him, to throw him out of my house. But something held me back. Deep down, I couldn't deny that I had noticed the same things. Diane had a certain allure, a kind of energy that was hard to ignore. And as much as I hated to admit it, there had been moments, fleeting, guilty moments, when I'd found myself drawn to her in ways I knew I shouldn't. But I wasn't like Matt. I had kept my distance, told myself it was wrong, that it could never happen. Yet, here we were. My best friend had crossed that line, and my stepmom clearly didn't regret it. After a long pause, I finally spoke, my voice low. "You need to leave, Matt." He looked at me, his face full of remorse, but he didn't argue. He knew there was nothing left to say. Slowly he got up, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the door. Just before he stepped out, he turned back, his face a mix of guilt and sadness. "I'm really sorry, man," Matt said, his voice filled with regret. I didn't respond, just watched as he walked out the door, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a heavy burden. The moment he left, I sank onto the couch, my thoughts swirling. I couldn't stop replaying what I had overheard Diane's soft whispers to him, the way their bodies moved together in the dark. It was wrong, so wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I couldn't ignore that Diane had chosen Matt, but I couldn't help wondering if it could have been me. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the events of the evening looping in my mind. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Diane, her touch, her lips, the way she had looked at Matt. But in my dream, it wasn't Matt, it was me. The next morning, the house felt unnervingly quiet. Diane didn't come down for breakfast, and I made sure to avoid her. I didn't know what I would say if I ran into her. But by afternoon, the silence was unbearable, so I went up to her room, my heart pounding as I knocked gently on the door. "Come in," her voice called from inside. I opened the door and stepped in. Diane sat on the edge of her bed, brushing her hair. She looked up at me with that same calm, knowing smile, as though she had expected me. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her tone almost caring. I didn't know how to answer. I stood there, staring, my mind racing with everything I wanted to ask. Why had she done it? Why had she chosen Matt? But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself moving closer, drawn to her despite everything. She didn't move or say a word as I approached, our eyes locked. And before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my hand grazing her cheek, my lips meeting hers. For a moment, she didn't react. Then slowly she kissed me back, her lips soft and warm. In that instant, all the guilt and confusion I had felt dissolved. When we finally pulled apart, I saw the same hunger in her eyes that I had seen in Matt's the night before, but this time, it was for me. "I didn't want it to be him," she whispered, her breath warm against my lips. "I wanted it to be you." Hearing her say that sent a shockwave through me. Everything I had felt, every confused, guilty thought suddenly made sense. Diane had wanted me all along. She had only turned to Matt because she couldn't have me. And now, here we were, crossing a line we could never undo. I stood there, her words echoing in my mind, the room thick with the weight of what had just happened. My heart was racing, my mind torn between what I wanted and what I knew was right. Diane, my stepmom, had just confirmed what I had feared all along. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of passion, it was something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. But as I looked into her eyes, that same desire reflected back at me. I realized this wasn't only about her wants. I had my own emotions to confront, ones I had buried because I knew they were wrong. Yet now, everything was out in the open. Taking a deep breath, I stepped back. "We can't do this, Diane," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This isn't right." Her expression shifted, the seductive glimmer in her eyes fading. "I know," she admitted quietly. "I know it's wrong," but she hesitated, searching for the right words. "There's something between us. I can't ignore it anymore." I swallowed hard, feeling the pull of her words but also the heavy weight of the consequences. "You're my stepmom," I said, shaking my head. "We crossed a line, and if we keep going, there's no coming back from this." For the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't the confident, alluring woman, I had always seen she was human, flawed, and just as conflicted as I was. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered, "or Matt, or anyone. But I don't know how to stop these feelings." A long silence settled between us, and in that stillness everything became clear. I had to be the one to put an end to this, not just for her, but for myself. I cared about Diane, but what we had done, or almost done, wasn't love. It was something else, something born from loneliness, confusion, and desire. "I think we need some space," I finally said, my voice steady. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a while. We need to figure this out, but not like this." Diane nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand," she said softly. "I'm sorry for everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A surge of emotions, desire, confusion, guilt collided inside me. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that I needed to walk away, but my body refused to move. The intensity of her gaze held me there, as if she had been waiting for this moment as long as I had, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself until now. Slowly I sat beside her on the bed. Diane reached out, her fingers brushing the back of my neck, pulling me closer. Her touch sent shivers down my spine, and I leaned in, our lips meeting again. This time the kiss was more intense, deeper, filled with a passion neither of us could control. As we kissed, her hands slid to my chest, her fingers tracing my skin, making my pulse race. I mirrored her movements, my hands wandering over her back, pulling her closer. The room seemed to disappear as we gave in to something that had been building for far too long. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, reality crashed down on me. I pulled away, breathing heavily, my heart pounding. Diane looked at me with a mixture of confusion and longing, her lips still parted from our kiss. "We can't do this," I muttered, standing abruptly, my mind spinning. This was my stepmom. How had we even gotten here? Diane's expression softened, and she sighed, standing slowly and approaching me. She rested her hand gently on my arm. "I know it's complicated," she said quietly, her voice calm and soothing. "But I also know you feel it too." She wasn't wrong. I felt it too, but that didn't make it any less complicated. "I don't know what this is or how to handle it," I confessed, still trying to wrap my mind around everything. Diane gave a soft smile, her hand trailing down my arm. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," she whispered. "Let's just take it one step at a time, no pressure, no expectations." I gazed at her, torn between the intense desire still surging through me and the gravity of what this meant. We had already crossed a line, and I knew there was no turning back. Despite the guilt and confusion, a part of me didn't want to go back. Diane moved closer, her fingers gently running through my hair as she placed a tender kiss on my cheek. "Don't overthink it," she murmured, her breath warm on my skin. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as my heart raced. Something inside me had shifted. Maybe Diane was right. Perhaps we didn't need to figure it all out at once. Maybe this was something that was bound to happen, something we couldn't resist anymore. I nodded, unsure if I trusted myself to speak. Diane smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. "Come on," she said softly, taking my hand. "Let's just lie down for a bit." I hesitated for a moment, but then without a word I followed her to the bed. We lay down beside each other, and Diane wrapped her arms around me, holding me close. The warmth of her body was both comforting and unsettling, but I couldn't deny the peace that began to wash over me as I closed my eyes, letting myself relax into the moment. The next few days were strange, to say the least. Matt didn't come around, and I hadn't reached out to him. I wasn't sure how I could face him after everything that had happened. And as for Diane, things between us had changed in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. We didn't talk about that night again, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. It was as though we had entered a new territory where the usual rules no longer applied. Diane seemed more at ease around me, more affectionate, a touch here, a lingering glance there. It was subtle, but it reminded me of the connection we had shared. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, she leaned in and kissed me softly on the lips. This time I didn't pull away. I kissed her back, allowing myself to get lost in the moment again. But then something unexpected happened. Diane pulled away slightly, looking into my eyes with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "We need to talk about this," she said quietly. "I know what's happening between us is real, but we also need to think about where it's going." I swallowed hard, knowing she was right. Whatever this was, it couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, we'd have to face the reality of the situation. "I don't regret what happened," she continued, her voice steady, "but I don't want to hurt you, or Matt, or anyone else." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time I realized just how serious the situation was. This wasn't just about us, there were bigger consequences at stake, and we couldn't ignore them forever. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm so confused." Diane reached for my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "But for now, let's take it slow. No rushing. We need to be honest with ourselves about what this is and what it isn't." I nodded, grateful for her calmness. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We didn't have all the answers, but at least we were on the same page. In the weeks that followed, things between us settled down. The intense passion was still there, but we were more cautious, more thoughtful. We talked openly, trying to understand what had drawn us together in the first place. It wasn't just physical, though. That was certainly a big part of it. There was something deeper, a connection that had been growing for years, even though neither of us had realized it. Eventually, we decided to keep things quiet for now, to give ourselves space to think and figure out what we truly wanted. Diane and I both knew that what we had wasn't sustainable in the long run, but we also knew we couldn't return to how things had been before. We had changed, and so had our relationship. As time went on, I found a sense of peace in that understanding. Diane and I were no longer rushing into anything. We were taking things slowly, letting them unfold naturally. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: whatever path we chose, we would face it together, with honesty and understanding. It was early summer, and I was spending some time at my dad's place out in the countryside. I had just finished my second year of college and needed a break. The woods behind the house had always been my escape, a quiet, peaceful place where I could clear my mind. And that day began like any other. I had no idea how much things would change by the time it ended. My stepmom, Clara, was 59, but you'd never guess it by looking at her. She was sharp, independent, and had this quiet way of commanding attention without even trying. She married my dad a few years after we lost my mum, and while they seemed happy enough, there was always this strange distance between us. It wasn't that we didn't get along, but there was something about her that I couldn't quite figure out. That morning, I got up early to go for a hike. The sun was warm, and the woods were alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It was perfect. I walked deeper into the forest, following a familiar trail until I reached a small clearing where I liked to sit and think. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, surprised to see Clara standing there with her hands in her pockets and a small smile on her face. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. I shrugged, trying to act casual, but I could feel my heart start to race. "Sure, if you want," I replied. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the trees around us before settling on me. "I needed some fresh air," she said, sitting down next to me on the fallen log. "You always seem to know the best spots." I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I guess I've spent a lot of time out here." We sat in silence for a while, just listening to the sounds of the woods. It felt unusual. Something about Clara was different today. She didn't have the same calm, composed demeanor I had grown accustomed to seeing around the house. There was a tension in the air between us, and I could feel it intensifying. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know, Chris, I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant, "about us." I frowned, unsure of where this was going. "US?" I asked. Clara turned to face me, her eyes carrying an intensity I hadn't seen before. "About how things have been between us since I married your dad. We've never really connected, have we?" I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "I mean, it's not like we had any issues," I replied, but she shook her head gently, cutting me off. No problems. But there's been a distance. I can feel it. And lately I've been wondering why." I didn't know how to respond. Clara had always seemed distant, but I figured it was because she didn't want to overstep, given that she wasn't my biological mum. But now, sitting there in the woods, Her words hung between us like a question that demanded an answer. "I don't know," I finally muttered. "I guess I just thought you didn't really care," she laughed softly, shaking her head. "Chris, I've always cared. I just didn't know how to reach out to you. And now—" She paused, resting her hand on mine. "I feel like we've missed something." I looked down at her hand, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the summer sun. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I just stared at her, my mind racing. What was she trying to say? "You're not a kid anymore," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've grown up." I see that now. Her words sent a jolt through me, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "What are you saying, Clara?" She smiled, but it wasn't the comforting smile I was used to. It was softer, more intimate. "I'm saying maybe we don't have to pretend there's nothing between us anymore." I froze, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "Clara, we can't," I started, but she didn't back away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her eyes locked onto mine. "Why not?" she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. "We've both felt it, you can't deny that." I didn't know what to say. I had felt it, the strange tension between us, the way her presence always seemed to affect me more than it should, but I had never imagined she would acknowledge it, let alone act on it. Before I could respond, she closed the space between us, pressing her lips softly against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, like she was testing the waters, but as I kissed her back, it deepened, becoming something more urgent, more real. Everything else faded away, the trees, the birds, even the guilt. It was just me and Clara, lost in a moment that felt both wrong and inevitable. Her hands moved to my face, pulling me closer, and I found myself responding instinctively, without questioning what this meant. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaky. Clara smiled again, but this time there was a sadness in her eyes. "I know," she whispered, "but I also know we can't ignore it anymore." I nodded, my mind still spinning. I didn't know what the future held, or how we were supposed to navigate this new reality, but I did know one thing: I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. "We'll figure it out," I said quietly. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off her dress, her expression more composed. "One step at a time," she said, "but we need to be careful, Chris." "Yeah, we will," I replied, nodding in agreement. As we walked back through the woods, the air between us felt charged with something neither of us had expected, but couldn't deny. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, we would face it together. For now, though, it was enough to know that we had finally acknowledged what had been simmering beneath the surface. We didn't have all the answers, but we had time. And for the first time, we had each other. As we made our way toward the house, the woods seemed to close in around us, sheltering us from the outside world. Everything felt more vivid: the sounds of the birds, the rustling leaves, and the tension between Clara and me. My mind was still spinning from what had just happened, but somehow it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. When we reached the edge of the woods, Clara stopped and turned to me, her face calm, but her eyes still holding that intensity. "Chris," she said softly, "we can't let this get out of hand." I nodded, understanding what she meant. "I know. I don't want to mess things up for you or for Dad." She smiled faintly, reaching out to touch my arm. "It's complicated, but we need to take it slow. We don't have to make any decisions right now, but we have to be careful." There was a weight to her words, but I also sensed a mutual understanding. Neither of us had planned for this to happen, but now that it had, there was no going back. Ignoring it would only make things worse. "I'll follow your lead," I said quietly, my heart still racing. "We'll take it one step at a time." Clara nodded, her eyes softening. "That's all we can do," she agreed. She took a deep breath, giving me a small, reassuring smile. "But for now, let's keep this between us, okay? Your dad doesn't need to know anything until we figure this out." "Of course," I replied, my voice steady. "It's our secret." We stood there for a moment longer, the sounds of the woods fading into the background as we looked at each other. The intensity of the kiss still hung in the air, but there was something else, something calmer, more grounded. We were no longer just two people tiptoeing around an unspoken connection. Now, we both knew where we stood, even if we didn't have all the answers. Finally, Clara broke the moment, turning toward the house. "We should head back," she said, her tone lighter now. "Your dad will wonder where we've been." As we walked side by side, the tension between us began to ease. Clara seemed more at peace, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. There were still questions, so many questions, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of what might come next. When we reached the house, my dad was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. He turned to us as we entered, smiling warmly. "You two were gone for a while. Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just went for a walk." Clara chimed in smoothly, "The woods are beautiful this time of year. We just lost track of time." My dad laughed. "Well, I'm glad you're back. Dinner's almost ready." We exchanged glances, and Clara gave me a quick, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "We're okay." In that moment, I realized we would be. Over the next few weeks, things between Clara and me stayed calm. We didn't rush into anything, and we made sure to keep things as normal as possible around my dad. There were moments, glances, brief touches that reminded me of what had happened in the woods, but we kept our distance, careful not to let things escalate too quickly. But we didn't avoid each other, either. In fact, Clara and I started talking more, getting to know each other in a way we hadn't before. There was an honesty between us now that hadn't existed before that day in the woods, and as strange as it was, it felt good. It felt right. One evening, after my dad had gone to bed, Clara and I found ourselves alone on the back porch. The night was warm, and the stars were bright overhead. We sat in comfortable silence for a while before she finally spoke. "Chris, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. "I don't regret it, but I want to make sure that whatever happens next, we're both on the same page." I turned to look at her. The moonlight bathed her face in a soft glow. "I feel the same way," I admitted. "I don't regret it either, but we need to be cautious. We need to take things slowly." She turned to face me, smiling. "I'm glad to hear that. I don't want to rush into anything that could hurt us or your dad." I reached out, gently squeezing her hand. "We'll figure it out together, no rush." Claire's smile deepened, and for the first time, I felt like we were both standing on solid ground. There was no urgency, no need to force anything. We had time to work out what this all meant for both of us, and for my dad. And in the weeks and months that followed, Claire and I grew closer, but we kept things respectful and quiet. We understood the risks, but we also knew that what we had was real. We moved slowly, allowing things to unfold naturally, and eventually we found a way to be part of each other's lives that felt right. It wasn't always easy, but it was honest, and in the end, that's what mattered most. As I stepped into the living room, my heart skipped a beat when I saw my stepmom. She was playing with our dog, who was enthusiastically licking her face. When our eyes met, something sparked a connection that went beyond family ties. It was a peaceful afternoon, and when I stepped into the backyard, the sun gently cast a warm glow over everything. After a long day, I was seeking a bit of solitude, but as I rounded the corner of the house, I stumbled upon a scene one hadn't expected. There she was, my stepmom, sitting on the grass, playing with our dog. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. She looked different today, radiant in a way I hadn't noticed before. Her laughter was soft, like music drifting through the air, and her carefree attitude as she tossed a ball for the dog felt oddly intimate. I stood there, watching her for a moment. The way her hair cascaded over her shoulders, the way her lips curled into a smile whenever the dog returned the ball, it was captivating. I had never seen her in this light before, but something about this moment stirred a feeling in me I couldn't quite place. There was a tenderness, a softness I hadn't noticed in her before. As the dog ran towards her, she fell back onto the grass, laughing uncontrollably, her body fully relaxed. Without thinking, I found myself walking toward her, drawn to the playful energy she radiated. She looked up, her smile growing wider as she saw me approaching. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice warm and inviting. "Come join us." I hesitated for a second, my mind racing. There was something in the way she looked at me, something different, something that made my heart beat faster. I pushed the thought aside and slowly knelt down beside her, The dog barked excitedly, running circles around us, but my focus was entirely on her. Her hand brushed mine as she reached for the ball, and a surge of electricity shot through me. We played with the dog for what felt like hours, but time seemed to stand still. Every now and then, our hands would touch, our eyes would meet, and there would be a lingering moment of silence. It was as though we were both caught in a quiet tension, something simmering just beneath the surface, neither of us willing to acknowledge it. Her laughter, her smile, it was all pulling me in, making it hard to concentrate on anything else. The way she looked at me had changed softer, more inviting, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was feeling the same unexplainable pull that I was. Eventually, the dog tired out, collapsing in a panting heap beside us. She leaned back on her hands, stretching out her legs, and I did the same, sitting close beside her. There was a comfortable silence between us, interrupted only by the occasional bark from the dog. I glanced over at her again, and my breath hitched. The way the sunlight touched her face, casting a golden hue over her features, made her look almost unreal. She turned to me, locking her eyes with mine, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, sitting there in the grass, the tension between us growing thicker with every passing second. So she said softly, her voice barely audible, "What's been on your mind lately?" Her question seemed innocent, but the way she asked it, the way her eyes lingered on mine, made it feel like she was asking something much deeper. I wanted to tell her what I was feeling, to express the confusion swirling in me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shrugged, trying to brush it off. Not much I said, though my voice betrayed my unease. She smiled, tilting her head slightly as she studied me. "You seem different today," she observed. I can't quite figure out what it is. Her words hung between us, heavy with meaning. There was a playful glint in her eyes, as though she knew exactly what she was doing, exactly what I was feeling. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and desire. Before I could say anything, she leaned closer, her face mere inches from mine. My heart pounded as I felt the warmth of her breath on my skin. "Are you sure there's nothing on your mind?" she asked, her voice low and intimate. The tension between us surged, the air thick with anticipation. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to pull back, to stop this before it went too far. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in her gaze, unable to look away. Then, just as suddenly as the moment had started, she pulled back, laughing softly as if nothing had happened. "You're so tense," she teased, nudging me playfully with her shoulder. "Relax a little." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, trying to calm my racing heart. But the way she was looking at me now, the mischievous spark in her eyes, made it even harder to keep my emotions in check. We sat there in silence for a while longer, the tension between us hanging in the air. Every time her hand brushed against mine or our eyes locked, I felt that same magnetic pull, an undeniable connection. It was as if something unspoken but incredibly powerful was shifting between us. I wasn't sure what it meant or where it might lead, but I couldn't deny the way she made me feel. Part of me wanted to push it away, pretend this was just a fleeting moment. But another part, a stronger part, wanted to give in to the pull, to see where it would take us. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard, yet neither of us moved. The dog had long since fallen asleep, curled up at our feet, but we remained there, side by side, lost in the quiet closeness of the moment. Every so often she would glance at me, her eyes lingering just a little too long, her lips curving into a soft, secretive smile. This slow, deliberate dance of building tension was maddening, neither of us willing to break it. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, she stood up, brushing the grass off her clothes. "Well," she said, her voice light and casual, "I suppose we should head inside." But the way she looked at me as she said it, the way her eyes held mine, told me that this wasn't over. There was a promise in her gaze, an unspoken invitation that made my heart race all over again. I stood up slowly, my mind spinning with thoughts of what might happen next, where this unexpected connection might lead. As we walked back toward the house, the space between us felt charged, each step bringing us closer to something we both knew was inevitable. Although I had no idea what the future held, one thing was clear: this was just the beginning. As we stepped inside, the air seemed heavier, thick with unspoken words and simmering tension. The door clicked shut behind us, and the soft evening light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. She turned to face me, her eyes meeting mine, and for a brief moment, neither of us moved. There was something unmistakable in her gaze, now desire, curiosity, and a raw, electric energy. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, her lips slightly parted. I could feel the heat radiating from her, and it took everything in me not to reach out and close the distance. Then, without warning, she did. Her fingers lightly brushed against my cheek as she leaned in. Time seemed to slow as her lips met mine, soft, warm, and impossibly gentle. It felt as though everything we had been holding back, everything we had been feeling, was suddenly unleashed in that single kiss. Her hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body pressing against mine. My hands instinctively found her waist, holding her tighter as the kiss deepened, our breaths becoming more frantic, more urgent. Time seemed to vanish as we became lost in the moment, in the sensation of each other's touch. Her fingers tangled in my hair as she pulled me closer, her lips hungry against mine. The soft sounds of our kisses filled the room, each one more passionate than the last. I could feel the intensity building between us, the way her body responded to every touch, every kiss driving me wild. My hands traveled down her back, exploring the curve of her hips as she pressed even closer, her breath hitching in her throat. There was no turning back now. Whatever boundaries had existed before were completely shattered, and the only thing that mattered was this moment, this connection, this overwhelming desire consuming us both. She pulled back slightly, allowing us to catch our breath, our hearts racing in sync. Her eyes were dark with want, her lips swollen from our kisses, and I saw the same intensity reflected in her gaze. "I've wanted this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for so long." Her confession sent a jolt through me, igniting a fire I couldn't control. Without hesitation, I pulled her back to me, capturing her lips once more. Our bodies moved together, perfectly in tune, every kiss and every touch like a promise of more, of everything. There was no hesitation anymore, no holding back. It was just the two of us, completely lost in the intensity of the moment, consumed by each other.